I think it's also really important, as we recognize that we are on indigenous territories, to also recognize that indigenous peoples are involved in struggles for sovereignty over this land, and it becomes our responsibility to learn about these struggles and also to build political solidarity with indigenous peoples. So I just want to acknowledge that. I also want to thank the organizers of the conference. Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here and to be on this opening panel. So we are in a moment of great turmoil, of immense socio-political and cultural upheaval at the present, not only in Canada and North America, but around the world. The confluence of a number of catastrophes, each one seismic in itself, has shaken the foundations of nation states, as well as the international order that were instituted in another moment of great political turmoil, the one brought about by the great anti-colonial and anti-racist movements of the early to mid-20th century. This present coming together of the catastrophes has, of course, been building for some time now. We can identify their conditions of possibility. Indeed, we can even identify their inevitability. Neoliberalism, deregulation, and privatization. Colonialism, genocide, and white supremacy. Militarization, war, and intra-imperialist rivalry. The COVID-19 pandemic that has been tied to the destruction of natural environments, a climate crisis that is erupting regularly and with more and more ferocity, all giving rise to unprecedented flows of displacements and migrations. These catastrophes are deeply interlinked, and taken together, they are taking the planet and its peoples to a point of no return. The extent of the socioeconomic inequality within the countries of the North are being once again starkly intensified, as is the chasm between the global North and the global South. This then are the conditions that are shaping and rapidly reshaping the problem of, quote, the security of the nation state. This is a problem that is deeply rooted in the exploitations, violence, and destruction that are the very foundation of the international order. The global war on terror as the response to 9/11 is the moment, I believe, that marks the momentous turn that is bringing the peoples of this world to an edge of an unfathomable abyss. With the global war on terror, we saw the beginning of the outright assault by Western powers on the liberal democratic order that had been in place since the Second World War. We are now living through the disintegration of this order, and xenophobic nationalisms and fascisms loom ever larger on the horizon. What is offered in response is the defense of liberalism. In Canada, the discovery of the mass graves of Indigenous peoples on the grounds of residential schools graphically demonstrate how liberalism here has been couched in not knowing, quote unquote, the colonial violence that structures the foundation of the Canadian nation state. How this, quote, not knowing continues to shape the national community and its relationship to its state. One finds the same collective not knowing that shapes Canadian nationhood at work in the global war on terror. So that despite Canada's role as an occupation power in Afghanistan for close to 2 decades, somehow this is something that is not known to Canadians, who remain convinced they were saving little Afghan girls and their mothers. Watching the chaotic US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, after its 20-year occupation of that country, an occupation in which Canada was a trusted and reliable partner, one was struck by how differently, yet strangely similarly, the debacle was treated in the US and in Canada. Facing a barrage of criticism from the Republicans and from US military families, President Biden stuck to the view that the costs of the US remaining in Afghanistan would have been much greater had the occupation continued any longer. In Canada, media coverage was dominated by stories of Canadian soldiers, heroes who had served in Afghanistan and were now pained by this reckless US abandonment of the Afghans who had worked with and for them. Canadian soldiers were at the center of the media attention, which focused on their humanitarian angst, on their attempts, which were now committed to securing immigration visas and flights out of Kabul for their Afghan interpreters, drivers, etc. As US politicians, diplomats, and military spokespeople lamented the weakness, ineffectiveness, and corruption of the Afghan politicians they had themselves put in power, and of the weakness of the Afghan national forces that they had themselves trained and recruited. The Canadian stories were those of the heartbreak of the Canadians who were now betrayed by the US withdrawal. In both instances, the occupation powers were treated as having suffered the high costs and sacrifices in the Afghan war. The millions of Afghans killed, tortured, displaced, the destruction of families and communities were once again made inconsequential, as was the destruction across the Middle East, the escalation of Palestinian dispossession, the massacres of Muslims across Central and South Asia. The global war, its invasions, occupations, and proxy wars have transformed national politics in Canada, in the US, across the West more generally, but also across the Middle East, across South and Central Asia. Islamophobia was the war's governing ideology, and Islamophobia became institutionalized within national as well as global politics, their institutional structures and their national security establishments, not to mention the university. US nationalism would take a rampantly white supremacist turn, culminating in the Trump presidency. Canadian nationalism also shifted significantly to the right, as the discourse of multiculturalism gave way to public expressions of Canadian cultural superiority in relation to the medieval fanaticism of Muslims and Islam. While the political focus has now shifted to the right-wing white supremacist movements, we would do well to remember that liberals as well as leftists, feminists as well as anti-racist activists also exalted the freedoms on offer by the West, even if they remain incomplete in the view of the latter movements, as they demonized Islam as inherently misogynist and Muslim men as essentially hate-filled and violent, Muslim women as inherently passive and in need of being saved. This adoption of Islamophobia was to be found across the political spectrum, let me point out, including in the feminist movement, including in the social movements, of which many of us have been part for a very, very long time. And I want to highlight a number of key points regarding this discourse of Islamophobia that we need to keep our attention on. One, first, as Islamophobia legitimizes violence against and the disenfranchisement of Muslims, this discourse also serves to restabilize the idea of the West as an internally cohesive political cultural formation, and has given this formation new shape and content in a moment of crisis. Second, gender and sexuality are central to Islamophobic discourses. My point is that Islamophobia does not only set Muslim women, men, sexual gender minorities up for particular forms of violence and disciplinary projects, Islamophobia is also the grounds for the remaking of Western gender and sexual politics and identities, which I've discussed quite fully in my book, Contesting Islam, Constructing Gender and Sexuality. The third point is that as the ideology of the war on terror, Islamophobia, even though somewhat less visible in certain sites than was the case in previous years, is now deeply embedded in national and global politics, as this enabled the remaking of the liberal international order and the collapse of its institutions that we are now living through. Fourth, with the defeats of the US alliance in its various wars on terror, Islamophobia led and was the condition of the mainstreaming of white supremacist and allied ultra-nationalist politics and movements in Canada and the US and elsewhere. It was Islamophobia that allowed the discourse of white supremacy to become a potent force in national politics in North America and around the world. As we have seen, the adoption of the idea of Western cultural superiority did not take long to become transformed into the idea of white racial superiority, even if coded in liberal discourses of those, quote unquote, left behind by the benefits of globalization. And while somewhat toned down in public expression, Islamophobia reinvigorated and reshaped what Stuart Hall called the idea of the West in Canada, no less than in the US. We see the resurgence of white nationalism getting more politically organized and aggressive across Canada, even as the attempt to cling to Canadian multiculturalism organizes the articulation of whiteness to racial tolerance. If the discovery of the mass graves of Indigenous children pointed to one form of violence enacted by the Canadian settler state, the global support mobilized by the Black Lives Matter movement against police and vigilante violence showed how deeply remains embedded anti-racism, anti-Black racism in this society. This racism, rooted in slavery and colonialism, remains deadly even now, as does the anti-Asian racism that is rooted in indentureship, colonialism, and imperialism. These racisms are a constant feature of Canadian society. In the global war on terror, alongside the targeting of Muslims, Black as well as brown Muslims, was the police and vigilante violence against Indigenous, non-Muslim Black, and other communities of color. Anti-Asian racism erupted in full force with the emergence of the COVID-19 virus. The historical association of Asians with disease and contagion that shaped Western imaginaries in earlier historical moments came to the fore yet again. This racism focuses on Asian degeneracy. It shapes the earlier migrations of Asians to Canada. It continues to perpetually construct Asian Canadians as outsiders. In my earlier work on Canada, I have described this nation state as a triangulated racial formation, with the British and French, later joined by other Europeans, being exalted in its bilingualism and biculturalism as the real national subjects. The genocide and dispossession of Indigenous peoples, which remains ongoing, notwithstanding the adoption of reconciliation as a state and national project. And the third part of this racial triangulation, the racialization of Black, Asian, and other enslaved and colonized peoples as quote unquote immigrants, visible minorities, newcomers, new Canadians, against who the borders of the nation have to be constantly policed. In addition to their racialization, these borders are gendered, classed, and sexualized, as many of us in this room have documented in our work. These foundational sets of relationships are being reproduced in different manifestations in this moment of crisis, this moment of intensified and multiplied crisis. the surveillance and reinforcement of these borders that the reproduction of these relationships demand, political relationships, territorial, social, and psychic relationships, as well as borders, is what the insecurity of the Canadian state remains tied to. These insecurities are hence inextricably tied to the racial colonial dynamics of Canadian nation-state formation. They were exacerbated by the events of 9/11, by the global war on terror, as well as by contemporary anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movements, which include the indigenous resurgence, Black Lives Matter movements, movements against Islamophobia, anti-immigrant racisms, and wars and occupations. The context for addressing the insecurities of the nation state and its institutions include now the calls for decolonization of the university. These have all now become globalized movements. They have been brought into acute focus by the global health pandemic. Pandemic measures demonstrate how crucial the racial colonial logics and practices remain to the protection and security of the Canadian nation. COVID-19 became fixed in the Canadian imaginary as a foreign threat, given the early linking of the virus to China, animal markets, and Asian dietary practices. The racialized assumption that this Asian problem would remain in Asia helps account for the complacency of public health authorities, even as COVID-19 was spreading across Canada. This assumption drew attention away from the relation of the virus to decades of neoliberal globalization, environmental destruction, and the growth of migration around the world. COVID-19 became further racialized as the early public response of Canadians was to avoid contact with Chinese Canadians and soon other Asian Canadians, to avoid Chinatowns and Chinese Canadian-owned businesses, especially restaurants. These became the early casualties, the early economic casualties of the pandemic. Asian Canadians soon became targets for racist attacks. Hate crimes would increase steadily by 700% in Vancouver, the city I live in the pandemic's first year. The restructuring of the Canadian welfare state that escalated during the 1990s is the context for this health pandemic also. The public spending cuts eroded health and social services. Immigrant communities, code for racialized minorities, were scapegoated in this restructuring of the welfare state for overburdening social services, as the Liberal government linked the restructuring to the immigration program. The right-wing conservative government that followed further inflamed anti-immigrant racism as it implemented more cuts, including to Canada's Public Health Agency. Mandated precisely with tracking and preparing for emerging health threats after the SARS outbreak, the Public Health Agency was, as the Globe and Mail reported, quote, stripped of much of its capacity to gather outbreak intelligence and provide advance warning by the time the pandemic hit, end of quote. Hence, even as the restructuring was eroding the country's capacity to respond effectively to public health threats as a result of government policies, the racialization of people, as a drain on the nation's resources, and as a terror threat with the advent of the war on terror, this shaped the national response to the COVID-19 pandemic, defined as yet another threat embodied by the presence of Asian Canadians. In my work on the pandemic, I have argued that Canadian public health measures were centered on the protection of the economy first and the health and welfare of the professional middle-class white family, now exalted as the national subjects. Among other practices, this national subject's health was elevated over that of the frontline worker, a category that includes mostly people of color who work in the lower ends of the healthcare industry, and as well as the lower end of the labor market hierarchy generally, and especially in the food, services, transportation sectors. This essential worker also includes the migrant workers who work on farms and meat packing industries. That is the very industries crucial to securing the nation's food security. This frontline worker was now called upon to make sacrifices for the nation and was left largely unprotected on the front lines of the pandemic. Not surprising, the infection and death rates among people of color working on these front lines proved to be devastatingly disproportionate. Yet even as the frontline worker was deemed essential, this figure's racialized otherness made her completely inessential. She is the alien within, neither racial kin to the nation's family, nor equal citizen subject, straddling the status of essential worker and inessential non-national. Even when she has citizenship, she remains vital to the profitability and national security of the economy. It was thus primarily an economic calculus that organized her inclusion while proscribing her disposability. No moral calculus was thought to be needed to brought into play in these pandemic measures. The rational calculus rendered unnecessary the concern whether she lives or dies. After all, with environmental devastation, underdevelopment, and wars looming over the global south, there are plenty more lining up to replace her. The limits of racial liberal democracy and its forms of inclusion are evident in this dispensability of the frontline worker. COVID-19 has made death an ever-present reality in the spaces of the nation's everyday life. This threat of death comes not from some violent interaction between enemies, it is carried in the very air that sustains life. The virus reveals how this threat of death, not in the abstract, existential sense that animates Western philosophical treatises, but in the real corporeal political sense, remains racialized. If these treatises center the white citizen subject, arguing for the freedom and liberation of this subject, they disappear. The indigenous, the immigrant, the migrant, the people of color. Centered on this citizen subject, pandemic measures ground the idea that it is politically and socially acceptable to risk the lives of those providing care, securing food supplies, and maintaining the infrastructure so that they continue to service the nation's national welfare and economic survival. The sacrifice of these workers, their families and communities is a utilitarian matter to the nation state. How quickly this sacrificial logic, and that is what I call this, the logic of the pandemic measures in a new book that I have just co-edited on the COVID-19 pandemic. This sacrificial logic and how quickly it became normalized was visible in public expressions of gratitude for frontline workers exposed to the risk of death as the condition of their very livelihood. The mainly urban middle-class families who took to celebrating frontline workers every evening, banging pots and pans from the safety of their own porches and balconies, displaying thank you signs in their windows and front yards, extolled the virtue of these workers. This ritualistic outpouring of appreciation demonstrated how gratitude functions in the economy of racial sacrifice that are shaping the politics of race and nation in the global pandemic. Meanwhile, vaccine apartheid continues. The refusal to lift intellectual property rights on life-saving and justice-enhancing sharing of medical, scientific knowledge and technologies remains as it does in the deadly grasp of the Western corporate militarized states over the people's resources and life beings across the world. These are the roots of the insecurities and the security threats that these states and their nations face, and the peoples around the world who are fighting to save their humanity, fighting for the survival of their families, their communities. They are the ones who are constructed as the threat in this vision of national security. Thank you.